Hi guys, and welcome back to Caterpillar Cross Stitch. In this week's video, we're going to be making a wall hanging out of a finished cross stitch project. This one we have here is called Touch of Magic. So you're going to need your finished stitched piece, some backing fabric, some dowel, various ribbons, some wadding, scissors, thread, weighted tape, and a needle minder and pins. First off, I'm just measuring around the outside of the stitched area, around 2 to 3 inches on every single side. At this stage, it's better to leave more fabric than too little just in case. Because this fabric is Aida, it's quite easy to cut along those lines because you're just trimming along the grid lines. Next, you need to measure your backing fabric to the exact same dimensions as the front stitched piece. Trim that along as well, and if you are using some sort of pattern fabric the way I am here to go with a particular theme, you might want to make sure that the pattern is centralised. So I'm making sure here that the cobwebs will be running right down the middle of the reverse of the wall hanging. I've decided to leave about a 1 inch gap here, which is where the wall hanging will actually be sewn together. So I'm just using some basic pins to pin along that line, just so that I know roughly where it is. I'm also using my trusty penguin needle minder here to store those pins on when they're not in use. So next you need to line up the front of the cross-stitched piece with the front of the backing fabric. So on the outside you should have 2 reverse sides. This time I'm pinning again in the exact same places along that line, but this time it's going through both of the Aida and the backing fabric. Once you've done that and it's secure enough, you can remove the top pins that you placed in earlier that were only in the Aida. Next, you can use a sewing machine like I'm doing here, or you could always do this by hand to just sew really neatly in a straight line along the line of where the fabrics are pinned together. I'm using a pale grey thread here just so that it isn't visible at all when the piece is later turned inside out. I'm just removing the pins as I go along because now it's all securely sewn together. Do the same on both sides of this, so the left and right hand sides of the piece. Once that's secure, I'm just trimming off any excess because we don't want any extra fabric flapping around once it's been turned inside out. This is the fun part. So turn it all inside out. It's like a little sleeve here. It will look a little bit messy and maybe creased, but don't worry because we're going to be ironing that in a second. Next, you need to cut out your wadding. So I'm double layering this here. It just will depend completely on how thick your wadding is. You can get this online or from any local haberdashery shop. It will need to be slightly thinner than the width of the cross-stitched piece, just to fit inside nicely. So push that inside, try to flatten it down and just make sure that you've got enough room and it's not bunching up anywhere. So I then removed the wadding and gave it a quick press just using the iron. I've got a separate video on how to iron cross stitch, so I'll link that down below if you're interested. You can see with the edges here that the backing fabric isn't visible from the front. Now it's all nice and pressed and neat, ready to go. Put the wadding back inside and flatten that out. Make sure the wadding inside is central to the cross-stitch piece, which will allow you to have space either end to create the flaps. We're going to start with the top flap here, which will have the dowel pushed inside so that it actually hangs up. All I'm doing here is using the exact same thread I used earlier, which is a pale grey, a normal sewing needle to just really easily and simply stitch up that edge. I started with a knot and I'm going to knot the end there, but underneath, so you're not really going to see it from the outside. It might be a good idea to test this at the start just to make sure that you've got enough of a gap to be able to push the dowel through. It will depend on the thickness of the dowel that you're able to get, but this one's relatively thin, so it goes through quite easily. If the dowel is a bit too long, you can also measure that up and make it a touch smaller using a small saw. If you're getting the dowel from some kind of hardware store, you might also be able to get them to cut it off for you. Next, it's time to choose what kind of ribbon or rope you're going to be hanging it up with. I went to the shop and chose quite a few different options depending on the colours of thread that were used in the cross-stitch piece, but I went for this pinky purpley because I thought it matched really nicely and it had a little bit of gold in there as well to make it pop. Now for our weighted tape, you can get this from any local haberdashery shop, craft shop or online. I'm just folding this over to make it nice and heavy and sewing that into a sort of pocket at the bottom of the cross stitch wall hanging. This will make sure that when it is hanging, it will be nice and flat, and it's just going to hang really nicely. Again, I'm using the same method as before and just sewing up the edge, remembering to tie a nice secure knot at the end. And there you have it, your finished cross-stitch wall hanging. You can use this on any project you might have. It does work best with vertical projects, so portrait in orientation, but you can use this with anything really. Just remember to leave enough room around all of the edges and cut your wadding slightly shorter on the top and bottom edges. You can use all kinds of different ribbons and ropes to hang it up with, or even switch it out depending on how you feel. If you're going to use some dowel, you could even use the same piece of dowel and make multiple projects, especially if they're seasonal, and then you can just switch them out throughout the year. I really hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for being here and watching this video this week. If you enjoyed this kind of thing, then please do consider subscribing by hitting the button down below. Give us a thumbs up and leave me any comments down below on this video, and I'll be sure to reply. I'll see you next week. Thanks, bye.